All right, everybody, let's go ahead and get started. So thanks again for joining me. My name is Kevin Hancock, Director of Solutions here at Exostar. And today we're going to talk about the roles of policies in achieving CMMC compliance. So during today's session, David Rose joining us is going to do a demonstration of Exostar's Policy Pro application. If you'd like to follow along while he does that, there is a free trial link on the Exostar website available and also available at the URL you see here. So if you'd like to join along while David does the demonstration, if there's going to be a little bit of time while I do a short intro, so feel free to sign up and follow along. But before I dive into the presentation and demonstration, just want to cover a few housekeeping details. So today's session is scheduled to last 45 minutes to an hour. A portion of today's event is dedicated to answering questions. Now, a number of you submitted questions prior to today's webinar when you registered. I've got those on 2 slides at the end, and I'll cover those. You can also submit questions via the chat, and while David's presenting, I'll answer those questions over chat, or if you do it in Q&A, I'll also pick them up there as well. If for some reason we do have an outage during today's session, just wait a minute and try to refresh the page. You can also use that link you received via email to also try to come back in via that channel as well. This webinar is being recorded. If one of your questions is, will you be receiving the slide deck from today? The answer is yes. So as a follow-up to today's session, you'll get a copy of today's recording as well as a copy of the slide deck. If at any time after today's presentation you'd like to speak with somebody about Exostar, any of our different solutions, you can reach us in a couple of different ways. You can email us at cmmc-team@exostar.com. You can also come to our website, www.exostar.com. There's a chat feature there on every page, and one of our folks would be more than happy to answer your questions via that medium as well. So with that, I'm going to dive into my speakers. So as I mentioned, my name's Kevin Hancock. I'm joined today by David Rowe. David, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. My name is David Rowe. I'm the Business Development Manager here at ISMS, and I'll be walking you through the demo of the platform today.
Thanks, David. So before I turn it over to David for the demonstration, I'm first going to talk a little bit about where we are in the CMMC rulemaking process, give a quick overview of this Policy Pro application and how it can help help you develop those policies across the 14 control families. David will do a demonstration, then we'll do a quick wrap up and I'll answer the questions that were submitted. So where are we in the rulemaking process? So as many of you know, the CMMC ruling is kind of half in place. And the half in place is the 32 Code of Federal Regulations. That went into effect on 12/16/2024. What that put in place and defined was the CMMC program itself. It laid out the different levels. It pointed people to the right documentation, put in together the assessment guides, explained the policies and procedures around CMMC itself. What's not yet in place is 48 CFR. 48 is what will authorize CMMC to be put into federal contracts. So what that means in practice is that you can start to schedule a certified third-party assessment organization to come and do that assessment if you feel you're ready. It's got the links, as I mentioned before, for those assessment guides, so you can take a look at those and make sure where you are on the overall program and where you need to get to. So all of those things are in place, but it's not yet showing up in DoD contracts. Hopefully, as many of you know, the main difference between CMMC and what's currently in effect is that rather than having a self-attestation that you say you comply with NIST 800-171 and its 110 controls, this ruling requires a certified third-party assessor to come in and validate that you do those controls once every 3 years. It also lays the groundwork, or if you will, puts in the definitions of what a cloud service provider needs to do or be, and also more clearly defines what an external service provider is. Now, a cloud service provider, many of you may be utilizing these kinds of products, services, etc., to be where you store, process, or transmit controlled unclassified information. A good example of this is Microsoft M365 in GCC High. There are other services out there, absolutely. You don't have to be Azure GCC High. It is just an example of one that is a cloud service. External service providers are typically those organizations that are managed service providers, managed security service providers, etc., who may be providing you some capabilities around storing, processing, or transmitting CUI. They may be acting as an augmentation of your own IT organization, etc. And this says that those organizations don't necessarily have to be CMMC level 2, but those individuals who might be working with you or the products that they're working on will be assessed as part of your overall assessment. So those are the kind of the high points of the CMMC ruling. Now, obviously, we've had a change of administration in January. What took place then is when President Trump took over, he did put a regulatory freeze in place. That freeze is now over, and new regulations can be put in place. Now, this has most likely caused a delay in the 48 CFR. It won't touch 32 CFR. 32 CFR was in place before the Trump administration came into office. But obviously 48 CFR is not, so there may be a delay in that. However, just keep in mind, it's fully expected that the CMMC program will be put into place. This was originally put in place under the original Trump administration. It carried on through the Biden administration. This has been in flight for quite a while. It's gone through a number of administrations. It's fully expected to take effect. So just a reminder again of what CMMC is. What this does is it breaks down the defense industrial base into three different levels, if you will. Those levels are based on the kind of information you're going to receive to fulfill that DoD contract, or if you're a subcontractor to somebody who has a DoD contract. And the reason that's important is because DoD contracts have what are called DFARS clauses, Defense Federal Acquisition Regulations. These are things you must adhere to when signing these contracts. And if you have a contract and you have subcontractors on that, you're required to flow down those requirements to those third parties. So it breaks those, different contractors into three levels. The first level is the majority of the DIB, right? The defense industrial base. 63% of organizations fall under level 1. This means that you don't have any DFARS clauses. Your requirements are aligned with federal acquisition regulations. In those cases, there are 15 requirements you have around cybersecurity and physical security of information. This requires an annual self-assessment and an annual affirmation that you have those requirements in place. Level 2 is where you may receive controlled unclassified information as part of that contract fulfillment, or you may create that information as part of that. In those cases, at a minimum for level 2, you need to adhere to NIST 800-171 R2. Those 110 controls that are part of that NIST requirement. And if you're a level 2 certification assessment, right, because there's 2 different categories of level 2, a small percentage of contracts under level 2 will still allow a self-assessment. The majority of contracts will require this third-party assessment. If you fall in that category, you'll be required once every 3 years to have that third party come in and do an assessment of your compliance with NIST 800-171 R2. If you're in the self-assessment category, you'll just have to self-assess and self-affirm that you do that every year. You'll also, even as level 2 certification or C3PAO assessment, you'll also be required to self-attest and self-affirm that you continue to do these things on a yearly basis. If you're one of those few organizations that are level 3, you have 134 requirements. You have those 110 from NIST 800-171, and you've got 24 from NIST 800-172. In this case, you still are required to do an assessment once every 3 years, but that assessment is done by DBCAC, and you'll have to annually affirm that you do those things. If as you go through that third-party assessment, if that third-party assessor finds an issue with one of those controls, if it's a 5 or 3-point control, and each control has a point value, and those are designated in the assessment guide, the assessor will not pass you. If you have a 1-point control and it's an allowed 1-point control, the assessor will give you a conditional pass. You'll have 180 days to close that, what's called a POAM, a plan of action and milestone. That's what that POAM means on the slide. You'll have 180 days to close that. Then the assessor will come back, make sure you do that, and then they'll be able to give you a full pass. Now, when CMMC gets implemented, right, this is when 48 CFR, 60 days after 48 CFR becomes effective, there is still expected to be a phased implementation. That first phase is the first year. In those cases, it's still expected to be a self-assessment for level 1 and level 2. After that first 12 months, phase 2 will kick in. That's when you start to see the requirements for level 2 certification. Then, after 2 years, you'll start to see level 3 certification be required. And then phase 4, right, after 3 years, you would expect full implementation of the CMMC program. Now, please keep in mind that the DoD does reserve the right in particular cases to advance the planned phases for particular contracts. So just keep aware as CMMC is put into place, take a look at the contracts, make sure you understand what regulations are there and what the requirements are. Now, when we start to talk about CMMC, there are things that still need to be done today, right? If you have a contract with the Department of Defense or you're a subcontractor, you may have clauses that require you to adhere to NIST 800-171 today, right? If you've got that 7012 clause, it means that you may receive CUI, and if you do, you've said that you adhere to NIST 800-171. Now, the 7012 clause allowed POAMs to be in place for controls that you haven't yet fully complied with, but it also means that you have a plan in place and you're executing to close those. Now with 7019, another DFARS clause, If you've got that clause in your contract, you're required to do a self-assessment and score yourself, right? That self-assessment guide puts a value of 1, 3, or 5 points against each of the 110 NIST controls. So you'll have a score somewhere between a negative 203 and 110. And you're required to submit that score into the SPRS system. That's the Supplier Performance Risk System, which is a DoD system. They're the only ones that have access to it. They're the only ones that see it, but they do use that system and its overall supplier performance risk to help them when they're bidding contracts or when they're deciding who should win a bid on a contract, what I should say. And if you obviously, when you do your self-assessment and you identify some gaps and you don't have a perfect 110 score, you should be working to close those gaps. If you do close a POAM and you now have a certain control implemented, you should go ahead and go update your score into the SPUR system, right? It is a continuous program, if you will, around NIST 800-171 compliance. Now, when we talk about NIST 800-171, what we're talking about is controlled unclassified information. What we're also talking about is a system where you store, process, or transmit that information. And the controls that need to be put in place around that system are defined where that system is, who's part of that system, and the best way to determine that for your organization is to look at how CUI flows in your organization. Now, this is what's called a turtle diagram. It's pretty self-explanatory why it's called that. But what this helps you illustrate is how CUI comes into our system, which things in our organization may process, store, or transmit that CUI, the different employees or the different organizations within our organization that touch that, what they need to do with it, and then also when that contract ends, how might we remove that, either the people or the CUI itself from the system. This will help you define whether or not you need to consider your entire organization and all of your machines and IT systems and people and processes, etc., as part of the CUI data flow, or if you can put a boundary around only those things that store, process, or transmit CUI and define that as your system boundary for when you are assessing both your implementation of the controls, but also in the system when those assessors come out and start to determine how you're doing this. Now, when you go to build that system security plan, you'll need to know the extent of that system, who those different individuals and responsible people are. You'll need those data flow diagrams and that overall network diagram, including all the different hardware, software, etc. Now, we talk a lot about information systems here, but this isn't only a IT issue or problem, right? For many of the organizations out there, you may not be storing CUI on an information system. You may be receiving it as a diagram or a drawing or some hard copy of something. You may be receiving it via FedEx or email or mail or whatever, and you're storing that in a file cabinet. There are also parts of NIST 800-171 around employee training and physical security controls and all those kinds of things. All of those things involve other parts of your organization than just IT. So you need to think about all of those things, both when you're building the policies and procedures of what you're doing around CUI, but also when you're constructing those and who you may also have to involve. It also means that you may already have a number of these policies and procedures in place. And so take a look at those when you're looking at individual controls, because you may already have you may have already done some of these for other compliance or standards certifications that you as an organization have already achieved. Because as you'll see from David's demonstration of Policy Pro, you can use those as well as the templates that are part of Policy Pro as baselines to, kind of jumpstart you where you are in the process. Because you're also going to diagram that system, figure out what's in it, and then write the policies and procedures around that overall system. As you'll see, as David does the demonstration of Policy Pro, what we're providing you here is a platform that has the information you need to build out those policies and procedures for those 14 control families and those 110 individual controls. Gives you the ability to score those and determine what you may or may be lacking in that particular policy and what you may need to do to improve those. Not only if you use Policy Pro from scratch, but also, as I mentioned before, if you've got policies from something you've already written, say an ISO 2701 standard or something like that, that you've already accomplished for your organization, you may already have some things that you can reuse and feed those through the AI engine as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to David to show you how this actually works.
Thanks, Kevin. All right, so as Kevin mentioned, Exostar's Policy Pro is a SaaS-based platform designed to help you and your organization get compliant around the various requirements. So, the current requirements of the NIST 800-171, as well as the upcoming CMMC 2.0. Regardless of whether your organization is just getting started out, so maybe you really don't know where to begin, you don't have any of those policies and procedures in place, or maybe your organization is further along and you already have all of your policies created and you're working to close out those POAMs. Regardless of kind of the state your organization is, it's a great idea to use a tool like Policy Pro just to make sure that all of your policies and your documentation is in good order for that eventual audit, or even just to improve your current SPUR score. We'll start off using our policy builder tool, and this is really the first step of your CMMC journey to make sure that your policies and your documentation are in place here. So what you want to do is click on this policy planning information, and that'll bring up this pop-up here, which is a brief explanation of what policies are, as well as some of the other documents your organization should have or will need to create as part of this process. For example, it'll include documents such as your gap assessment, risk register, your POAM, the plan of actions milestones, as well as your system security plan or your SSP. If you don't have those documents, we do provide templates, which you can download via the links here. Otherwise, if you need further assistance than just the templates, there is a companion product that Kevin will be talking about in a second that's part of the CMMC Ready Suite. Called Certification Assistant, and that'll further help assist you generating both the POAM, SSP, as well as your SPUR score. Once you've exited out of this pop-up here, in today's demo, we'll be walking through an example of CMMC Level 2, and we'll start off with an access control policy. So once you've selected the policy domain, you'll be taken to our Prepare, Gather, and Consult page. This is everything you're going to need to prepare prior to even getting started writing the policies themselves. For example, it could include things like gathering your organization's documents, records, and other materials related to these various access control topics. Additionally, who you may want to consult with, whether they are internal or external stakeholders. For example, it could include people like your network administrator, head of IT, or CISO, and then any sort of outside contractors if applicable. So those are going to be your ESPs, MSPs, MSSPs, etc. Once you have all of that in place and you're ready to get started, you'll click on this button to be taken to our policy template. All of our policy templates are broken out into a couple different sections. We've got the header here, which includes your organization name, the department or departments this policy falls under, the issue date for when you finalized, approved by, and the tracking number. The tracking number can be used in a number of ways. However, most people use it to keep track of the version number of their policy. So as you work on updates and revisions, as you're periodically required to review and update your policies, you'll update that version number accordingly. The other sections include the purpose, the scope, and the individual practices. So again, for level 2, there are going to be 14 policy domains and 110 practices. We break out each practice individually, and we also give you some additional information outside of just the practice description from the standard. And that is the guidelines, which you see here underneath. And the guidelines will help you understand exactly what sort of information is typically included in that practice, as well as kind of in plain English, explain what that practice is about. Once you're ready to begin working on the policies, you'll click on the pencil icon here next to each practice or each section, and that's going to bring up this pop-up for 3.1.1. We can see that our policy is going to be about our organization's account creation, work from home, and bring your own device policy. A couple notes as you're working through these policy templates. One, ensure you're reading through the entirety of the policy. What's written here should really reflect what your organization has implemented or what your organization plans to implement in the future based off your policies and your procedures. Um, another tip is to, as you're reading through these policy templates, you want to make sure that there's certain sections that definitely need to be customized. And we'll walk through an example here together. So in the first paragraph, it talks about all account creations will be submitted by the requesting department manager to the IT support email just for completion using the account request ticketing system or other process. So there, depending on whether or not you're utilizing a ticketing system to handle those account creation requests, if not, whatever other process it is you're utilizing, that's what you want to make sure to fill in that section there. So as you're working through these and customizing them, we've added a number of productivity and collaborative features into Policy Builder, including mentions as well as comments. So you can add additional users onto your Policy Pro license and be able to work collaboratively with them. As I mentioned in the prepare, gather, and consult portion of the platform, you'll need to work with a number of other team members, including external folks. So if you add, for example, an MSP, you can work collaboratively on your policies together to ensure that what's written here really reflects your actual implementations for your organization. Once you've made those changes, you'll save any changes you wish to make, and that's going to timestamp it as well as who the user was that made the change, as well as another new feature, which is version history, which is going to keep track of all of the changes that you've made throughout your through your policies, and this is a great way to show evidence that you're periodically reviewing and updating your policies. So again, one of the requirements is that you're periodically reviewing it, and you're always going to need evidence of your various activities. So this is just a great way to make sure you can prove that, as well as being able to go back to a previous version if needed. You can also reset an individual practice as well by clicking on the reset button, and that'll take it back to the original template language. Once you've done all of the sections here that I mentioned, you're going to click on this export button located on the bottom right-hand corner. And that's going to bring up this pop-up here. This is just warning me that I haven't gone into those other sections here to customize that, but assuming I've done that, it's going to do a couple things. It's going to combine all of those sections I mentioned previously, so the header, purpose, the scope, and the individual practices, into a single access control policy that's then going to also be saved as a Word document to your local drive. It's also an important kind of final step for Policy Builder and for this access control policy prior to moving on to the next feature of the platform. Moving on to policy assessment, this is that AI component, and this is how you're going to assess your documentation to make sure that there are no gaps. As Kevin mentioned previously, maybe your organization is further along and you've already gone ahead and done the work of creating CMMC policies, or maybe you've done it like Kevin mentioned for other standards or just other various policies and documentation that you know might be related to, let's say, an access control policy. What you're going to want to do is click on this upload button here, and you're going to be able to attach, again, any sort of document, whether it's a bulk access control policy that meets CMMC, whether it's a policy created using our policy building tool, or maybe you have multiple other related documentation. So for example, maybe you have an acceptable use policy, account creation, maybe a password policy. You can upload all of those into policy assessments. And once you've submitted those documents, we're going to assess and analyze that document for you. And you're going to click on this detailed scorecard to bring up this pop-up here. We assess your documents in a number of ways, both at a high level as well as a granular level. At the high level, the overall assessment for this document appears relevant in size, scope, and organizational customization. The overall assessment is comprised of three different metrics, which is the relevance, and that kind of covers how many key terms or phrases are included in your policy. The higher that is, the higher the relevance and therefore overall assessment will be. The model similarity compares the policy you've uploaded to our model documents. And we do that for two reasons. One, to ensure it's been appropriately customized to fit your organization and your organization's implementations, as well as ensuring that it's covering everything it needs to cover. Finally, the word count is simply to ensure there's enough context surrounding those key terms and phrases to accurately assess your documentation. So if you see that word count as too low, chances are the overall assessment and overall score might not necessarily be an accurate reflection of how your policies are doing. In terms of the overall score, here you can see my policies that I've uploaded scored as 57.2%. However, our scoring is not like an academic score, meaning 90% as an A, 80% as a B. Our overall scoring is a relevance scoring system, meaning anything above a 50% shows you have a relevant document. And we'll talk a little bit further on in the demo about how you can use the overall score to gauge how your policies are doing currently, as well as how they're doing over time, along with the other metrics to really get an overall view of your policy documentation. So that's everything at the high level, but we also provide some granular feedback as well in terms of exactly what are those gaps and how you can improve your policies to address those. And we do that through our key elements not included, or KENNY for short. And we have two different types of KENNYs. We've got the control KENNYs as well as general policy KENNYs. My first example of a control KENNY is going to be CUI non-public information. That is that key term or phrase that's missing in my document that I should be looking to include. We can see some additional information underneath that as well, which is the actual practice from CMMC/NIST that it's associated with. In this case, it's 3.1.22, controlling information posted or processed on publicly accessible information systems. If you're still not sure exactly what 3.1.22 is discussing, We do provide the discussion requirements directly from the NIST requirements, so you don't have to flip back and forth between the platform and the standard to figure out exactly what 3.1.22 is discussing. Additionally, the documents for examination are going to be other sorts of documents, records, or materials that might be relevant to that control, Kenny. So if you need some additional information about how you can address that, Kenny, within your policy, you can look towards other documentation your organization might have that is directly relevant to that control, Kenny. So some examples of that might be a security plan or a list of users authorized. Again, basically any sort of documentation that's relevant. Additionally, once you've actually incorporated it into your policies and you've implemented it within your organization, these documents for examination also acts as a list of evidence or a list of artifacts that you can show an auditor that you are indeed doing that particular control and that you've actually gone ahead and implemented it within your organization. The general policy Kenny terms are very similar in the sense that there are also key terms and phrases that are missing in my document. However, you'll notice there's no collapse all, expand all button with that additional information. And the reason for that is these are not tied to a specific practice like the ones above. They're more generic to the policy domain you've uploaded into, in this case, an access control policy. So as you work on addressing these Kennys, you can also upload and re-upload it. So as you periodically review your policies, maybe you've left certain things out or certain things have changed and you need to update the Kennys as a result for your policies. So you can upload your documents and re-upload as many times as necessary and be able to make sure that the end result of that is going to be a policy that addresses everything you need to address. You can also export these results into a PDF as well. So if you want to share it with others or just have a hard copy or a local copy of these results, you can do that by exporting it. One last feature I want to talk about here in policy assessment is this management approval. So I'll go ahead and click management approved here, and we can discuss it further in the dashboard. The dashboard is where you'll come to see all your progress and work throughout the platform, whether you're creating policies in Policy Builder or assessing policies in Policy Assessment. All of that work's going to be reflected here in the dashboard. Additionally, with that management approval, I can see here in the green check mark my most recently management approved policy, who the user was and when they approved it. So one of the requirements is that senior officials in your organization, whoever is in charge of your CMMC program, signs off on your program. One way to keep track of that and to ensure that everyone in your organization knows the most recent management approved policy, you can use that management approval feature as well as being able to show evidence. Again, a large portion of a program like CMMC is to actually show proof of the various activities you say your organization is actually doing. Any previously management approved policies is going to be there in the blue check mark, so you'll be able to know that you have a more recent version that you've actually gone ahead and created. You'll also notice all of those other metrics I mentioned previously, so the Kennys, both the control and general, as well as that overall score. So as you work on incorporating those Kennys into your documentation, you'll notice those Kenny numbers going down and your overall score going upwards. But again, as long as it's above a 50%, the more important numbers to focus on are the Kennys. So addressing as many of the Kennys that's both relevant to your organization as well as there will be times where you might have addressed the Kenny in a way that's not necessarily reflected in the platform. That's totally acceptable as well. And so you may have a couple outstanding Kennys. Lastly is our reference library, which is where you can come to if you need some additional information or guidance as you're working throughout the platform. So whether you're creating policies in Policy Builder or assessing policies in Policy Assessment, there'll be times where you need some additional information. And so we've collected and put various resources, mostly directly from the NIST Institute on various topics. And this is just a more efficient / more accurate way of getting the information you need. For example, maybe one of your Kennies was related to VPNs and you're unsure how to address that within your policies. Instead of Googling for the information, which will give you obviously a lot of commercial results, you want to make sure that you're following the NIST guidelines as you're crafting out your policies for your organization in order to actually meet the CMMC requirements. Everything in today's demo was done for level 2. We also have level 1 available on the platform as well. So if you select that level 1 button there, that's going to swap over the policies and the practices. So it'll switch it over to the 6 policy domains and the 17 practices. As Kevin mentioned previously, that will depend on whether or not you're transmitting, storing, processing, or creating CUI, as well as your contract clauses. You can always work on level 1 if you're unsure, and then once you realize or you know that your contracts do contain those defarce clauses, and you know you're going to have to be going for level 2, you can always swap over to level 2 at a later time and work on the remaining policies and practices. So hopefully that's been a helpful overview. Again, policies and documentation is kind of the bedrock and cornerstone of your CMMC program, of your cybersecurity program. And so you want to make sure that all of your policies are in order. And without these policies, an auditor will not be able to know exactly what it is your organization should be doing, and so they won't be able to assess your implementations without those documents. Kevin does have a couple more things to walk through, so thank you for taking a look at this demo, and I'll turn it over to Kevin now.
Great, thanks, David. So as I wrap up here, let me just get this back up. All right, so Policy Pro is part of Exostar's CMMC Ready suite. It includes 2 companion applications, one certification assistant that builds upon Policy Pro and really gives you a platform to manage your overall CMMC program. It allows you to house, obviously, those different policies and procedures you have, build those implementation statements that you have around each control, put in against those the evidence that you have that you've actually implemented those, and then really allow you to manage that overall CMMC program. It walks you through that self-assessment and scores for you while you do that. So at the end of the day, the output of Certification Assistant is a system security plan, an SPRS score that you can then, or a score that you can then enter into the SPRS system. Creation of POAMs as you go through, so you then can work against those, etc. If you are looking for an enclave to store, process, and transmit CUI, Exostar has a solution around that. That's our managed Microsoft 365. This is an enclave up in Azure GCC High that Exostar attests to 85 of the 110 controls that are taken care of by Exostar in that fully managed enclave. If you're looking for a third party to help you along this journey, whether that's for a readiness assessment or a gap assessment, if you're ready to do a mock assessment, if you're actually looking to engage with a C3PAO, Exostar has a number of partners. Those partners can be engaged with you through the Exostar tool, so they do your policies, procedures, your CMMC program, etc. in Certification Assistant Policy Pro. They often utilize Managed Microsoft 365 as that enclave, and they can build that overall CMMC program with you, help you manage it, etc. Now, as I mentioned, we had some questions submitted before. I think we have 8 of them. So I'm going to go through those. So number 1, discuss that this is a whole company approach for compliance and not just efforts from an IT perspective. So hopefully I did address that during my kind of intro about CMMC, because when you build your CMMC program, it is going to include all portions of your organization. There are controls that involve other things than just IT. Oftentimes there's a big focus on IT because much of this, people start talking about network diagrams and data flow diagrams and all those kinds of things, and people's mind obviously goes straight to IT. But there are physical controls and there are training necessary things. There are processes and procedures, et cetera, that are outside of IT's purview. So you really need that representation from the other parts of the organization to also get involved and become part of the program. Number 2, is it possible to combine policies, or are 14 policies needed? So how you write those policies is really up to you. But what I will say is you've also got to consider when the assessor comes on site, how is it going to be for them when they're reviewing those policies, procedures, implementations, et cetera, so they can easily recognize which pertain to which of the different controls or individual controls and the control families themselves, because that's what they're going to assess against. So the easier you make it for that assessor to know that, look, this policy pertains to this control family, the easier it will be for them to understand that. Absolutely. So you can do it, but that may require additional explaining on your end when that assessor comes on site. So number 3 was submitted. It's a long question, but I thought it was important, so I wanted to make sure we addressed it. So if we're missing a 3-point or a 5-point security control from NIST 800-171, and their question said Rev 3. However, I just want to be very clear. CMMC specifically calls out NIST 800-171 R2. So that's what you're going to be assessed against for the CMMC program. Are we even allowed to self-certify on the SPRS website? It seems there's a conflict in the laws between ECFR, et cetera. So this is, I think, conflating some of the different things that are going on. So there are current clauses in your DFARS contracts, namely the 7019 clause, that requires you to do a self-assessment and score yourself and submit that score into the SPRS system. So that's a requirement you may very well have in a contract today. So regardless of it's a 3 or 5-point security control that you're missing, you should get a valid score and submit that score into the SPRS system. That's a contractual obligation you may very well have today. You should do that. You should open a POAM against that control. You should manage that POAM to closure. When you close that POAM against that control, you should then go into and update that score. Now, with that said, if you've engaged with that certified third-party assessment organization, before you do that, you should ensure that you don't have any 3 or 5-point items open, because they're not going, when they come on site to do the assessment, or when you start to exchange documentation with them about your current state, if they know that you're missing a 3 or 5-point control, and they will, right? Because they'll be able to evaluate that. They're going to stop their assessment and say they can't proceed until you fix that, and then come re-engage with them, because you're not allowed to have a 3 or 5-point control open for the assessors. They'll just stop their assessment. They'll ask you to close it and re-engage with them when it is, and then you'll kind of start the whole process over again. So understand, it's different than what's due today in the SPRS system and what's going to be coming in CMMC. So hopefully I cleared that up. So you will be getting this slide. as part of the deck, right? This just gives you some additional information and sources of information. I'll just finish up with the last few questions. Do you have a list of policies that are required along with a summary or description of these policies? So as David mentioned in his description and demonstration, so Policy Pro does contain templates for each of the different 14 control families. It then allows you to customize those for your organization and then allows you to determine if you've customized them enough, whether or not they're relevant enough, whether or not there are keywords or other things that are missing from those, and allows you to manage and improve those over time. When is the end of self-assessment for level 2? Well, and the answer to this question is going to be kind of, it depends, because for some contracts at level 2, self-assessment is not going to end, right? In the way CMMC is currently written, there are going to be level 2 contracts that still allow you to self-assess. Now, that determination is going to be made by the contracting officer. And you'll see that on the contract, whether or not this requires a third-party assessment or a self-assessment. So, one answer is it's never going to end. The other answer, if this is a question about is when level 2 will take effect or when CMMC will take effect, it is when 48 CFR is finally put into the federal regulation, and when that implementation phase ends. It's expected to be 1 year after 48 CFR is when phase 1 ends. 48 CFR is expected to be done in 2025. So then sometime in 2026, it'll be, in effect, if you will. So number 6, do we need a SPURS score for each of our different cage codes? This is, I guess this is going to be it depends, and I wish I had a better answer for you. The way I understand it, when you go into the SPRS system, it is per cage code. So you will need to enter a score for each of your cage codes. Now, if your different organizations, or your different cage codes share the same system and the same policies, procedures, etc., you can use the same system security plan and the same self-assessment, etc., for those. If those vary, then you will need a different system security plan. Now, there may also be some overlap, right? You may have consistent policies over 85% of your business, but there may be 5% that varies from site to site because they have different physical controls and things like that. So that's why it's going to vary depending on whether or not there's a different SPURS score and kind of what you should enter into the SPRS system. As a micro-sized subcontractor, what should our SPURS score be? Again, this is going to depend on the contracts that you're signing up for. If you're a micro-sized subcontractor who's looking to sign a contract that has level 2, CMMC level 2, and that contract isn't self-assessment, then you'll need, well, regardless, if it's level 2, you'll need 110 score. Number 8, do you need GCC high for your Microsoft environment if you keep all CUI on a secure on-prem server? Now, the answer here is no. There's nothing in CMMC that requires a GCC high Microsoft environment. NIST 80171 is very, clear in that it doesn't recommend solutions. It doesn't recommend that you use a particular kind of, cloud service or anything like that. It gives you the guidelines that you need to ensure are enforced. How you choose to enforce those, how you choose to put those in place are all about your policies and procedures and how you fulfill those obligations. So everybody, I think that ends today's presentation. I want to thank you all for joining us today. David, thanks so much for your time and your demonstration. Joey, thanks for answering questions over chat. And everybody, I hope you have a great day, and hopefully we'll be talking to you soon. Thanks so much.